Howdy everyone. So I couldn't help but notice that auteurs are having a bit of a moment. By the end of the year, 2024 will have brought us self-financed mega-budget epics from Francis Ford Coppola and Kevin Costner, another high-tech Zemeckis flick, and a new Yorgos Lanthimos joint less than a year after his last one took home 4 Oscars. Not that auteurism is new by any stretch of the word. Ever since the idea of what we would go on to call auteur theory was introduced in Walter Bloem's 1924 book, The Soul of the Moving Picture, movies have almost always been looked at as an expression of a singular vision held by its director, even when the film itself is an adaptation of a previous work or an original one written by an entirely different guy. But the recent slate of high-profile passion projects got me curious. What makes an auteur an auteur? And what are the limitations of auteur theory? Most importantly, what's an interesting way to answer these questions without relying on examples from the usual suspects like Stanley Kubrick or Steven Spielberg? And then it hit me, Prince.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life.
Let me give you some good advice, Junior. Your music makes sense to no one but yourself.
Why should he do your music? He's been getting along just fine without it.
Punk, brat, gigolo,
Cabbage head.
What's the matter, afraid to die?
Yes?
Well, I ain't afraid of shit.
No! Dear Dad, man, why'd you leave us? Sometimes I feel cursed to make the same mistake.
A man can only take so much.
Just hear me out. I recently got a copy of the new 8K scan of Purple Rain, and it made me realize that his very rocky attempt to break into motion pictures would be a great way to explore this subject. Because I believe that to fully understand auteur theory and the way that we apply it to some of the best filmmakers around, we should stop and apply it to someone whose work as a director wasn't good enough for him to stick around. And who better than the guy whose directorial debut tied with Howard the Duck for Worst Picture at the 1986 Razzies? To get things started, I want to briefly outline what auteur theory is so that we're all working from the same definition. No Film School's article on the subject plainly states that, quote, the auteur meaning, when it comes to film and cinema, is a specific kind of director who has such a strong signature sensibility that you know his or her film without seeing their name on it. They authored the film. The director's fingerprints are on everything. To build off of that, the term's creator, noted film critic Andrew Sarris, had originally specified that auteurs must be a good director to begin with, have traits that make their work unique, and include interior meaning or subtext in their films. Some examples of auteurs include the directors Alfred Hitchcock, Wes Anderson, and Richard Linklater. But even when considering Sarris's additional specifications, I subscribe to the belief that you can call just about any director that's had anything resembling a recognizable career an auteur, because you're always going to have to account for subjectivity and the human condition. For instance, and I swear this isn't me trying to call him out or anything, Andrew Sarris himself went as far as to call Kevin Smith the next Martin Scorsese in a 2000 issue of Esquire. A statement that could have felt true at the time, I'm sure, but in hindsight turned out to be pretty off the mark.
Wow, look at these morose motherfuckers right here. Smells like somebody shit in their cereal. Bung!
When it comes to art, I've always felt that whether something can be considered good or bad from a formal point of view has little say on whether or not it has meaning. For every Bergman or Lynch, there's an Ed Wood or Kevin Smith. Directors with a recognizable style and approach to filmmaking that we can, for better or for worse, see from a mile away. Skill at the craft be damned. While we can't necessarily talk about those filmmakers in the same breath as we can more technically proficient ones, I still think they count. It feels dismissive to hard-code a prerequisite for directors to be good into discussions of their work because it flattens their work into a black or white paradigm of worth your time or not. And that feels antithetical to why I choose to analyze the movies I watch in the first place. Which brings us back to Prince. If you've been living under a rock for the past few decades, or just aren't into Lindrums, it hardly feels like a stretch to call the self-professed skinny motherfucker with the high voice the musical equivalent to an auteur. Prior to his death in 2016, he was a multi-hyphenate singer, songwriter, performer, band leader, producer that could play multiple instruments. He wrote his own songs, led his bands with an iron fist, and was dead set on preserving what he called real music by real musicians. Hell, the early stage of his career even had him try to model himself after Stevie Wonder to an extent by performing every instrument heard on his records, to the point where he turned down Maurice White of Earth, Wind & Fire when his label proposed having him produce his first album. Similar to how directors spend their careers developing a cinematic language that often owes itself to the works of the directors that inspired them, Prince developed his own vernacular that would appear throughout his liner notes, often sang about the same topics, and repeatedly modeled aspects of his sound and stage presence on the work of his idols Sly Stone, James Brown, George Clinton, and the list goes on. Not to mention, there was his often androgynous stage presence that gave him a unique visual flair, similar to how directors like Wes Anderson have deliberate approaches to staging and camera placement. The point I'm trying to make is that while it's debatable whether or not you can even apply auteur theory to music in the first place, Prince is an obvious example of what we would consider to be an especially pronounced one within the medium. And the fact that he had a stretch back in his heyday where he tried to write, direct, and star in stories for the silver screen makes him a great subject for a video on auteurism in film. His career presents the rare opportunity for us to see an obvious equivalent to a cinematic auteur in one medium try to cross over to one with a completely different set of rules. And since we know a lot about the guy thanks to his music, interviews, and the like, we may as well have a cheat sheet we can rely on to decode any potential meaning from his work. Additionally, I'm also just a Prince nerd that thought it would be a fun change of pace when it comes to covering a well-worn subject. So today, I'll be sitting down to cross-examine Prince's 3 attempts at being a theatrical film star. I'll be looking at Purple Rain, Under the Cherry Moon, and Graffiti Bridge in order to see what each film says about him, whether there's a through line to them, and if those movies can ultimately stand to teach us anything about auteur theory and its strengths or weaknesses. But before I do, I'd humbly like to ask you to consider subscribing to this channel if you're enjoying what you see so far. In conjunction to video essays about movies, I also host 2 podcasts about them that you can watch right here on the channel or on their shared RSS feed. I'd also love to ask you guys a quick question of the day to answer in the comments if you want. What's your favorite movie starring a musician and why? My answer actually isn't a Prince movie at all. It's A Hard Day's Night starring the Beatles. Anyway, on with the video and spoilers if you care. Okay, so Purple Rain. The film dropped in 1984 and is a romantic dramedy that was vaguely inspired by Prince's life. It follows a character named The Kid and his band The Revolution as they struggle to achieve recognition at Minneapolis's famed club First Avenue. The Kid is a talented musician who lives at home with his abusive father and his abused mother. Whenever he isn't pissing off First Ave's owner Billy, the Kid can be found courting a newcomer to MPLS named Apollonia.
Apollonia?
She's also being pursued by the Kid's rival Morris Day, who has a band named The Time and is trying to put together a girl group. The two of them butt heads a lot, and because Billy has been getting sick of the Kid's stubbornness when it comes to his music, the Revolution is put on Skid Row. Following that development, it then becomes clear to the Kid and the Revolution that the only way they can secure their spot at First Ave is by hitting a home run at their next performance. On paper, Purple Rain is a simple movie that really just exists as an excuse to let Prince showcase his talents, promote a few of his satellite projects like The Time and Apollonia 6, and fulfill a seeming dream of his to star in a movie. And guess what? It's pretty good. It follows the basic formula of the 80s high-concept movie by being a zippy, easy-to-follow story with a bunch of fun pop music. It has memorable characters, some strong neon cinematography, and does everything it needs to do in under 2 hours. But what does it say about Prince and auteur theory? Well, technically nothing because he didn't direct Purple Rain, at least not officially. But it's still not without its importance to his film career because it's basically the Rosetta Stone for everything that would follow. I get how this probably seems like a huge wrench getting thrown into the premise of this video, but allow me to explain why it isn't. While Prince wasn't the director of Purple Rain, that honor goes to Albert Magnoli, multiple sources confirm that Prince was something of a backseat director during its production. The story goes that he would do his own rewrites of the movie, that he would watch dailies, and that he basically spent every second he wasn't on camera watching Magnoli to pick up on how to direct for himself. And it's not hard to see why this was the case. In Alan Light's book, Let's Go Crazy, Prince and the Making of Purple Rain, it's stated that the artist was something of a movie guy. He watched them regularly, and according to Jill Jones, a Prince associate who appeared in 2 of his movies, was even a fan of David Lynch's Eraserhead. You can even see shades of this in his music too, from naming his 90s keyboardist Tommy Barbarella after the Jane Fonda movie, to borrowing the chant from The Wizard of Oz for his live show, or even by writing a song titled Blanche in a nod to the play and film A Streetcar Named Desire. In fact, Purple Rain wasn't even his first attempt at making a movie or first instance of him being a backseat director. His earliest known attempt was 1982's The Second Coming, which was intended to be a concert film that tied ideas together from his album Controversy through interstitial sections and vignettes. That film was directed by Chuck Statler, and though it was abandoned and information on it scant, was seemingly put on ice partly due to Prince's bossiness when working on the project. So it's easy to see that, though he didn't lead the production himself, Purple Rain is very much Prince's movie and reflects his vision. It came about in large part because Prince actively pushed for it to get made and refused to re-up with his management until he was promised a major motion picture.
We've done, I think, a magnificent job, so I'm sure he'll sign it. Barnoli calls, and he tells Joe and I, "You're not going to believe this," but he won't sign it unless you get him a major motion picture. And you can't get some drug dealer to finance it. You got to get a major studio, and he wants his name above the title.
The guy wrote the non-score music for it. A huge chunk of the cast is made up of artists he's worked with before, and it's inspired by his life story. As far as we can tell, the only reason he didn't direct it himself is because he didn't have any experience as a director yet. At any rate, a benefit we get from this not being a Prince-directed work is that it gives us a baseline to compare his later efforts to. Seeing as this movie was the work of Magnoli trying to make a Prince movie for Prince, it set a template for what defines a Prince film that we can later look to for guidance on understanding his style and would-be auteurism. While Magnoli never went on to find much success directing features after working on Purple Rain, it also helps that his work on this movie is pretty good. If I'm being blunt, his input was actually a huge part of what makes the movie work. He added some much-needed heft to the film by actively pushing for it to be more of a document of who Prince was as a person, as opposed to just being another rock and roll flick. He also rewrote the script himself and worked on it as one of its editors. By all accounts, Magnoli took the job of capturing who Prince was as a person very seriously.
This is the scenery, this is the scene there, this is authentic, and we're not going to change anything because it will not be an authentic movie. And then they said, well, we have a few casting ideas. We think that it would be good to have John Travolta play Prince. And I said, I don't like that idea. Prince has to play Prince because that's part of the authenticity that I was talking about a moment ago.
If we think about Sarris's criteria for auteurship, the interior meaning that Magnoli sought to express here wasn't his own, it was Prince's. Every idea he brought to the table had the singular goal of putting us in the performer's head, like how he decided that the movie should open on a performance. Magnoli apparently sold this as his spin on the baptism scene in The Godfather, cross-cutting between locations to get the film started on a high note. And indeed it does. It's a genuinely great sequence that works for the same reason that something like the opening to Star Wars Episode 4 works. Rather than drop you into the middle of some long expository sequence or try to convince you that Prince is a particularly strong dramatic actor, it introduces you to the world and its characters on their terms. We get to listen to one of the strongest album openers of all time. We get to jump between locations while being shown just enough information to understand who everybody is and what part they'll play in the story itself. And it's also just so damn fun and efficient too. In less than 10 minutes, we know everything we need to. Morris is a womanizer who's way too into himself. Apollonia is a broke singer who wants to get her big break. And Prince is a frickin' madman musician who's just a bit too into himself in a way that's the inverse to how Morris is. It's the exact type of choice that this movie needed. Furthermore, because Purple Rain is full of such level-headed ideas like that one, it opens its more unique aspects up to interpretation. The film also hints at them being greater expressions of Prince's creativity than something Magnoli or the original screenwriter came up with too, because they would later crop up in his other movies, such as the film's obsession with duality and how it pertains to its subject. Purple Rain exists as an extension of the lore Prince had built up by 1984. It took his strong affinity for the color purple and turned it into his calling card. I've always thought of Prince's fascination with the color as coming from two possible places. One, his name. Prince. Royalty. Purple. Royalty again. But two, as a reflection of his being a self-professed Gemini.
I think I was just being who I was, being the true Gemini that I am.
On the one hand, Prince's music was often a fiery explosion of lust and desire. On the other, it was a cool, exploratory expression of creativity. The first hand is hedonism, and the second is piousness from a man who spent his life practicing one of two forms of Christianity. And when you put those colors together, you get purple. Just as his earlier records juxtaposed expressions of lecherousness against a more chaste or modest expression of the act, Purple Rain tries to do the same. It balances the idea of Prince as a tender lover against the idea of him as a jealous, violent one. It depicts Prince as a horned-up goon on stage while also making room for him to be a person living in an abusive household. Abuse that we know he actually endured from his father on some level, thanks to the odd mention of it from people like his longtime sound engineer Susan Rogers, or from his music in songs like Papa from his 1993 album Come.
Don't abuse children, or else they turn out like me.
He even kinda mentions it in an old Larry King interview before trying to downplay it a second later.
You had a rough time with your father, right?
I wouldn't call it rough. I mean, he was very strict disciplinarian, but all fathers were. I learned the difference between right and wrong.
Purple Rain also taps into the duality of Prince's relationship with his father and music. Though we don't know for sure just how much of the kid's dad, Francis L., is inspired by Prince's real dad, John L. Nelson, we do know that there are some similarities. Namely, the abuse I just mentioned, and the fact that he was a struggling musician in a failing and eventually failed marriage. Knowing this stuff recontextualizes a lot of the movie because it unpacks what you're looking at and strips some of the distance afforded to it by being a work of fiction away. It makes the distinction between the facade of the kid's life at the club and the reality of what he comes home to after playing a show even clearer, which Magnoli amplified by depicting First Ave as a, to use his own words, mecca of sorts, and most of the world outside of it being inversely gritty.
What role did First Avenue play in this film?
It was huge because one of the things I knew immediately was that I needed the mecca.
The non-club scenes lend a vague new Hollywoodness to the movie that reminds you that you're looking at a version of Prince's life story. A heavily fictionalized and remixed one, yes, but one that still has its roots in his life on a more psychological level. Even Purple Rain's original writer, William Blinn, has more or less just admitted that Purple Rain was Prince trying to work stuff out about his dad. Blinn said that, quote, Prince was semi-communicative about his dad. You could tell that his father is very key in what he's about. It was as if he was sorting out his own mystery, on an honest quest to figure himself out. It's safe to say that this stuff didn't end with his dad either, as elements from his relationships with his peers or with himself inevitably worked their way into the movie too. Prince's inability to play well with others got reflected in his refusal to accept input from his bandmates Wendy and Lisa, who ironically began to feed more input into the band's music after the movie dropped. In Purple Rain, it's a huge point of contention between them that he needs to work through, but once he does, he's able to grow and achieve the much-needed victory his career needed at the moment. Likewise, Prince's sonic palette more or less exploded once he started letting the once-called girl bros in on his process. Similarly, Prince producing music for other artists under the name Jamie Starr and inadvertently creating a rival for himself in the time got mirrored in the form of them being his band's rival in the movie.
How's the family?
It also appears through Morris trying to create a girl group to get the Revolution tossed off their spot at First Ave. Even Apollonia 6 is just a slight revision of the Jamie Starr-produced group Vanity 6. As Lisa Coleman, the Lisa and Wendy and Lisa put it, Purple Rain feels like Prince opening up. There's a level of self-awareness and introspection at work here that we seldom got from just his music. Even better, it's more complex than it ever needed to be, and paints Prince out to be a flawed, gifted person that contrasts well with Morris, a character who's implied to also be hiding behind a similar stage persona. It's an artist allowing himself to tell a director his life story and trusting him to remix it into a 2-hour film that dusts it for fingerprints.
I found prints! No, fingerprints. I don't think so.
And if we go back to our definition of auteurism, even though Prince didn't direct the film, that lends him a strong sense of authorship towards it, because this movie is a great portrait of who Prince was at the time. The facts may not be on display here, but the vibes are. That duality I made a point to mention is on full display. The straight-up misogyny that's played off as comedy, the reverence for women while simultaneously treating them like objects, and the strong religious undertones that permeate throughout his career are all there. For God's sake, his sex scene with Apollonia literally happened after they listened to a backmasked recording of a woman crying, which was followed by a song titled God. All of the defining characteristics of who Prince was in 1984 happen in the span of 1 minute in that scene. Even the song that plays us into the film itself has straight-up religious connotations.
You know, Dearly Beloved, Let's Go Crazy was about God and Satan. You know, me dealing with that dichotomy. I had to change those words up. The de-elevator was Satan in that song. Now, I had to change those words up because you couldn't say God on the radio.
It's a well-directed movie that's biggest crime is that its cast is made up of mostly non-actors. It has unique traits, such as the heavily princely soundtrack and the juxtaposition of very grounded, grimy locations against the glitzy hive of First Avenue. And last, the film has intent and meaning, which is to show what Prince's music feels like, what it feels like to be Prince, and to show you that letting people into your life as opposed to just using them is ultimately a good thing. But more than that, it serves as a key to making heads or tails of its 2 follow-ups. Movies that actually got directed by Prince and show him trying to grasp at some sense of cinematic identity. Prince returned to the silver screen almost exactly 2 years after Purple Rain with 1986's Under the Cherry Moon. Given the massive success of Purple Rain, he was basically allowed to make whatever movie he wanted to, and with that creative freedom, set out to star in a rom-com that was inspired by 1930s screwball comedies. He plays a guy named Christopher Tracy this time around, a gigolo and pianist who lives in France with his brother Tricky. The two of them find out that a woman named Mary Sharon is about to turn 21, and that, if one of them can successfully marry her, they would stand to get some of her $50 million trust fund in the process. Naturally, shenanigans ensue. Christopher gets on her father's bad side, and he finds himself earnestly falling for Mary, who learns how to cut loose from her snobby upper-class roots in the process. It's a cliché story, full of the sort of beats one would expect from this type of movie, but represents one in a series of massive left turns for Prince. After striking gold with Purple Rain, a lot of people expected Prince to play things safe for a bit. You know, put out another album with a similar sound, go on another tour, and maybe act in another movie that was cut from a similar cloth to the one that made him a star. But Prince, perhaps much like the kid, didn't do what was expected of him and instead made some choices that arguably hurt his commercial appeal. He followed the album up with 1985's Around the World in a Day, a record that definitely owes part of its sound to Purple Rain, down to the track America reusing the drum pattern from Baby I'm a Star by the way, but takes more influence from psychedelia. Additionally, he initially refused to release any singles to promote the record or do any music videos. He also didn't tour the album, though this could have had something to do with him working on Under the Cherry Moon. It was probably clear to anyone paying attention that Prince didn't want to be pigeonholed after tasting superstardom. Many consider Around the World in a Day to be the anti-Purple Rain for that reason, and for better or for worse, Under the Cherry Moon and its accompanying soundtrack Parade follow in that pattern. The movie even goes the extra mile by eschewing the musical performances that made Purple Rain iconic, outside of one pseudo-performance halfway through the movie and a music video that plays over the credits.
Christopher ain't gonna fall into that trap. No? Too cool for that.
And unlike with Purple Rain, Prince even took on directing this movie after its original director Mary Lambert jumped ship just over 2 weeks into shooting. As for how that went for him, badly. Very badly. Under the Cherry Moon came out to scathing reviews back in 1986. Critics did everything from call it, quote, disarmingly amateurish to calling it, quote, an annoying exercise in narcissism. And in the case of Roger Ebert's review of the film, said that it felt like Prince was, quote, trying to combine an old Fred Astaire film with a perfume commercial. While it's since gone on to get a minor critical reappraisal over the years, many contemporary reviews also still feel the need to prime their thoughts on the flick with statements about how it has its fair set of flaws. Now, me personally, and at the risk of sounding like said contemporary reviews, I love this movie. It's a mess, yeah, but it's a mess that I adore as much as I like stuff like Around the World in a Day or Parade. And a huge part of that has to do with how lacking in self-control it is. It's easy to take a single look at Under the Cherry Moon and laugh at how tone-deaf it is to what the average moviegoer might have wanted from Prince, but I think there's a lot to admire about it. Even though it's a marked departure from what made the first movie work, it still has more in common with it than you would expect it to. Purple Rain's Morris Day character, who was something of a fan and critic favorite in that movie, is more or less the basis of Prince's Christopher Tracy. He's been smoothed around the edges a bit and given a bit more to do than primp for the camera and be a misogynist, but the hallmarks of what made his character such a delight to watch are all intact. And his sidekick Jerome, played by Jerome Benton, has even been transplanted to be Christopher's sidekick Tricky here.
Tricky, put the phone down.
Never danced before midnight, but if you insist.
Even the plot has several obvious similarities to Purple Rain. While Christopher and the kid are very different characters, they can both be described as rascally outsiders with large egos. You know, like the one Prince was infamous for having. The kid's manifested itself in his often stubborn and self-indulgent stage antics, playing 1 or 2 songs and then storming off stage in an act of self-sabotage. And Christopher's manifests itself in him picking fights with Mary Sharon and later goading her father over the fact that they're together. In both cases, they serve as manifestations of Prince's rude boy persona he had developed at the start of the decade. The two of them are also gifted musicians that, though they come from different backgrounds and only one of them seemingly wants to be one, take their skills for granted. Not to mention, both characters hold a deep sense of resentment or even fear towards the thing they're pursuing. In Purple Rain, the kid has the clear goal of becoming a famous and respected musician. It's the obvious objective for all of his performances at First Ave, and we can infer that he's afraid of turning out like his father Francis L. someday. Likewise, Christopher spends Under the Cherry Moon trying to get Mary Sharon to fall in love with him so that he can steal her money. But rather than take the most direct routes to their goals, these characters repeatedly complicate things for themselves. The kid does this by pissing everyone off who tries to extend an olive branch to him, and Christopher does this by constantly squabbling with Mary and her father as opposed to trying to get in their good graces.
You ain't funky at all. You just a little old prude. Just a little rich party poop.
Shut up!
Another strong parallel I couldn't help but notice between both stories is that they partially center around the relationship between a father and their child. While it's true that Mary Sharon's father is presented as an antagonist in this story, it's only because the story positions Christopher Tracy as our protagonist. Don't get me wrong, he's definitely a dick that could stand to loosen up and, not get Christopher killed, but he's also a parent that's trying to do well by his child. Which is what makes comparing him to Francis L. a fascinating pairing. They're authority figures that Prince's characters both either resent or are afraid of becoming. I'm not a shrink or anything, so take this with a comically large grain of salt, but it makes you wonder if this had something to do with Prince's relationship with his own father, and whether or not he approved of some of the stuff his son was doing on stage at the start of his career. I mean, Prince is playing a literal male sex worker in this movie, after building a reputation as one of the most lurid performers in the business. That, plus the fact that his side project Vanity 6 was initially going to be called The Hookers, makes it kinda hard to not get curious about this stuff. Especially since this sets the film's narrative up to be about a rich, i.e. more traditional father figure who sees right through Christopher's games and thinks of him as some dirty person that's below his daughter's standards. The film couldn't be more explicit about a father figure being dismissive over Prince if it tried to.
Give this to Isaac for me.
Fuck you.
Tell him it's Chinese.
All I'm saying is that this isn't that far-fetched. We already engage in dialogues about how part of Steven Spielberg's filmography can be read as a man's attempt to process his parents' divorce from when he was a teenager. So maybe this stuff is true about Prince too. Even the overarching arc of the story feels in line with what we got in Purple Rain. Both Christopher and Mary learn to love each other over the course of the movie, going from squabbling like siblings to planning to leave France together, with or without the money that brought Christopher into Mary's life in the first place. Christopher learns that it's important to love and connect with people as opposed to using them. Meanwhile, Mary learns that there's more to life than the one her father gave her. Both characters essentially come to understand that there's more to life than what they had at the start of the story, and that they don't have to go at things alone, which is more or less the same exact lesson imparted by Purple Rain. There's even the same vaguely religious subtext in this movie as there was in Rain, as both movies center on the Prince character's redemption from a life of sin and his becoming a person who transcends his background. There's nothing quite as on the nose as Prince singing Christ-inspired lyrics like he did in I Would Die For You here, but the idea of him dying as a martyr for Mary to get out from under her father's thumb and become her own person shares a similar train of thought. In both movies, we're presented with the idea that Prince is a virtuoso that knows more than anyone around him and was ultimately right all along, even if he had to learn a few things for himself in the process of proving it. Except there's one tiny little problem when it comes to comparing Under the Cherry Moon to the film that made him a superstar. He didn't have an Albert Magnoli in his corner this time. If you'll recall from the last chapter, I said that Magnoli was a huge part of what made that movie work. Though he hadn't directed before, Magnoli had enough of a background in the medium to serve as the necessary guiding force to make a movie that audiences enjoyed. Prince, however, doesn't.
Shit!
While it's true that he had originally hired Mary Lambert to direct this, she was gone in just over 2 weeks. And if Jason Draper's Prince biography, Chaos, Disorder, and Revolution is to be believed, she also got demoted into an advisory position only 4 days into shooting. If one thing's clear from what we know about Under the Cherry Moon's production, it's that the Prince that had scared the original director off the set of The Second Coming and was notorious for basically giving his side projects completed songs to perform karaoke to for their final release was large and in charge on set. The only problem, though, is that his experience producing music didn't lend him any experience producing a film. Under the Cherry Moon is a sight to behold because of how much of a B-movie it is. We're talking obvious ADR that goes over lips that aren't even moving, first takes getting used on the regular even though the actors nearly broke during them, and subtitles getting added on account of a few thick French accents in the cast that Prince lacked faith in his audience's ability to understand. And yet, for all of its flaws, it's also a charming and engrossing watch. There's a ramshackleness to the production that's endearing. Parts of it border on feeling like a home movie, or the sort of thing myself and a number of people who grew to love filmmaking in the early days of YouTube would have made with a camcorder and a copy of Windows Movie Maker. Despite being a commercial romantic comedy from the dead center of MTV mania, it's presented in black and white and often shot like a drama. Warner Bros. Forced Prince to shoot the movie in color, but he wouldn't budge on the decision to present it in black and white and converted it to be grayscale once the movie entered post-production. It's a confused beast of a movie that can't tell if it wants to be a sweeping romance or a silly cult film, and there's nothing quite as princely as that dichotomy. This is the guy that wrote Delirious, a goofy rockabilly song about how horny he gets whenever a woman gets near him. The dude wanted to make a schmaltzy 30s movie, and by God, that's the movie he got to make. By losing the formality of having a real director, we see just how much of Purple Rain was Prince and how much of it was Magnoli. which is something that I feel is substantiated by this quote by Lisa Coleman in reference to Magnoli signing on to direct Purple Rain. For the longest time, we would just talk about it like, we're gonna make the best cult movie. It's gonna be cool, we're just gonna put it out there and see who responds to it. Then Al Magnoli came and actually kinda connected with Prince, and Al was the one who was like, if we're gonna make a movie, why don't we make a hit movie? It seems like we've got all the parts here. Let's not just make some artsy movie just for fun. What do we have to lose? In the years I've been a Prince fan, I've occasionally dabbled with the idea that he may have been too creative for his own good. That perhaps because he was capable of writing and recording as much high-quality music as he did, he would often fail to give some of his best ideas enough time in the sun. Or worse, that he would try to do that and would overcook them in the process. You could see shades of what I'm talking about in stuff like refusing to tour for some of his best albums in the US, or writing too many songs for a single project, then overproducing the ones that finally made the cut. And because Prince could be an almost painfully insular artist at times, that there was seldom anyone willing or able to talk him out of his more questionable decisions. Which, given some of the stuff I mentioned about Prince and his resentment of authority in these movies, totally tracks. It's because of this that I can't help but view Under the Cherry Moon as being the work of Prince in a turbocharged auteur filmmaker mode. For while the film may not live up to Sarris's criteria of being particularly well directed or featuring much in the way of intentionality, it carries Prince's undeniable hallmarks. It straddles the line between male and female gender roles, especially when you consider the fact that Prince is the gold digger in the Gold Digger comedy story. It cribs comedic hallmarks from the silent and early sound era just like Purple Rain did with an Abbott and Costello bit. And it even features in-jokes such as Prince's old man voice that fans would recognize from some of his music and public appearances.
I said, it's the wine. Hang on, love, I have to use the bathroom. Somebody gonna see my bald spot.
Some of the issues that plague the film, like the ADR I mentioned earlier, are also Prince to a T. For example, it's all over his 1987 concert film Sign of the Times, which he directed in part to get out of supporting his arguable best album with a lengthy US tour.
Hey, Cat, why don't you let me take you out tonight? Fuck off!
And for what it's worth, I do see some intentionality in Under the Cherry Moon. For example, there's a great beat towards the end of the movie. Mary has just left Christopher, and distraught, he begins to drink his feelings away before being greeted by a former client of his. The sight of her horrifies him, and what follows is a use of editing and sound that recalls something you'd see out of a David Lynch movie.
You know, I miss you. Christopher, you know, I miss you.
A comparison I feel confident in making since we already know that Prince liked Eraserhead. Anyway, the beat in question even reminds me of one of the most iconic moments in Blue Velvet, though that's only coincidental since that movie opened several months after Under the Cherry Moon did. Despite being a simple sequence, there's something about it that speaks volumes to what Christopher is feeling. That was the moment of the story when he decided to cast his life away as a gigolo and be with Mary. Additionally, he had just fallen out with Tricky at that point, and we hear Tricky's girlfriend try to tell him that he'll end up without any friends if he keeps that kind of behavior up, to which Tricky replies that he doesn't need friends and that he's his own man, like Liberace.
You're gonna end up with no friends at all.
I don't need friends. I'm my own man. Just like Liberace.
And I shouldn't really have to spell out how referencing Liberace ties into Prince, right? Like, I think we all know who in this movie has anything in common with the highly flamboyant, gifted pianist Liberace. I especially love this bit because of how it riffs off another great scene between Tricky and Christopher at their apartment. The two of them were arguing during that scene, and Prince made the perfect call as a director in scoring it with an orchestral version of his track Old Friends for Sale, which was tracked way back in April 1985, almost half a year before this movie got shot. Fans will recognize that song as one of his most autobiographical pieces, at least until he changed the lyrics for its proper release in the 90s, and as a song about an imposing sense of alienation and betrayal that Prince felt following the success of Purple Rain. While this would go unnoticed by the average moviegoer in 1986, let alone today, it's an example of there being some truly genuine emotions at play in this movie. Christopher and Tricky are arguing about Mary and the wealth she represents, and the song's emotional core of success being a double-edged sword carries the scene on its shoulders. Look, to wrap things up here, the film is fine. An absolute train wreck at points and a huge misfire for Prince's career insofar that it hurt his burgeoning run as an actor, but an enjoyable, mostly harmless ride. If you ask me, Under the Cherry Moon probably doesn't deserve half the hate it got back in the day. I didn't even get to discuss this since it didn't have any bearing on Prince's potential auteurism as far as I could tell, but it's also worth noting that the movie is a total feast for the eyes. We're talking black and white photography, even though it was originally shot in color, that was captured by Scorsese's longtime cinematographer Michael Ballhaus on location in France. Seriously, this movie has some of my favorite shots I've seen in a while, and they're just tossed in casually throughout the movie's hour 38-minute runtime. And if I can just take things back to Lynch for a second, there's also something to be said about how this movie looks like a hodgepodge of the 1930s and the 1980s. It's similar to how many of Lynch's projects take place in then contemporary times, but get lensed through 50s Americana. Granted, it precedes Lynch doing that since that started with Blue Velvet, but it's still fascinating to think about. With Under the Cherry Moon, it feels like Prince tried to subvert a lot of what we expected from him thanks to Purple Rain. It dodged the same performance scene progression from that film, aimed to be a more lighthearted, less dramatic affair, and swapped many of the things one might associate with the artist, like drum machines, synths, neon, or hell, color in the first place, out for the gorgeous French Riviera and a more traditionally European sound palette. But despite all of that, it's still a gander at Prince's personality. If anything, the lack of princely set dressing only serves to highlight how Prince it is. It communicates that there's more to the guy than pouting behind Apollonia at First Ave, or that there's more to him than hopping on stage in his bloomers. And I think that hints at another limitation of auteur theory, which is that it's only a theory. Unless a director comes out and says that it's right, we can't definitively state whether our readings on their work and style are accurate. We can only infer on it and hope that we're right thanks to some additional research or through interpretation.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
Elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
Even though auteur theory heavily focuses on a director's authorship over a work, there's still a component of individual interpretation at play there. Which is fine, of course, because that's half the fun of consuming art in the first place, but it means that we might overlook some details or pull the wrong readings out of them. For many, Under the Cherry Moon being the so-called anti-Purple Rain that it is might be proof that Prince isn't an auteur. But as I've shown here, I don't think that's the case. The presence of similarities between both projects and the lack of the same creative forces outside of Prince behind the camera shows that a singular voice is being carried over between these projects. It's just buried under our understanding, or lack thereof, of Prince. 1990 brought us Prince's last attempt at being a movie star. His final feature, Graffiti Bridge, is a rock musical and pseudo-sequel to Purple Rain. Though it is worth mentioning that the sequel status is somewhat debatable since some pages like IMDb call it an unofficial one. I don't know what about this makes it unofficial since it literally has the cast from the first movie and was created by the star of it, but I digress. It picks up several years after Prince swore that he was a star that would die for us, and shows that he has, in fact, not yet become a star or died for anybody. By now, the revolution is so gone that nobody refers to them even once throughout the film, and in their place, we have a new band. They don't get named properly as far as I can tell, and even stuff like Prince Vault's page for the movie just refers to them as The Kids Band, but they're basically just the first incarnation of his real band from the 90s, the New Power Generation. At any rate, here's the gist of things. Following the death of Billy, the owner of First Ave in Purple Rain, the Kid and Morris Day were handed co-ownership of the club Glam Slam. And since then, Day has also opened his own club right next to it named Pandemonium, as well as owns 2 other clubs on the same intersection too. In the years since Billy's passing, it seems as though Morris has become something akin to a mob boss through his constant strong-arming of characters played by Mavis Staples and George Clinton in a never-ending pursuit for more money.
We got to make more money.
On top of that, Morris and the kid are more combative than ever thanks to the kid's newfound obsession with making what the movie likes to call spiritual noise. A girl/angel named Aura, played by the poet and one-time Prince satellite artist Ingrid Chavez, shows up and finds herself in the middle of their squabbling. They're both interested in her for different reasons, find themselves competing for her attention, and also find themselves competing for ownership of Glam Slam. When things come to a head between them at a battle of the bands, Aura ends up thinking about American Beauty or something and then gets herself killed in the process. Everyone's sad, the kid sings a ballad, and his feud with Morris is magically over. The end. In case my summary of the movie didn't give it away, allow me to speak more plainly. This movie sucks. Like, I'm not the kind of person who usually comes out and just calls something bad, but yikes. Not without an enjoyable moment or two, but that's about what you can expect from it. An enjoyable moment or two. Graffiti Bridge reflects everything that went wrong with Under the Cherry Moon, only with the added baggage of being sold as a follow-up to Purple Rain. If his previous film was a commendable effort due to his attempt to break away from what had proven to be a massive success for him, Graffiti Bridge feels like a calculated effort to spite you for having expectations in the first place. It almost seems to relish in the fact that it exists as a sequel to Purple Rain by not being a sequel to Purple Rain. Aside from some very surface-level references to that movie, it has nothing to do with it. It barely even commits to following the same basic formula that the other film did. Whereas Purple Rain mostly stuck to a clear and simple pattern of cutting between performances and dramatic scenes that move the plot along, Graffiti Bridge cuts into its musical performances with frequent breaks for dialogue, truncates songs in its soundtrack, or includes straight-up musical segments that don't make sense in their presented context of being a performance by a band. The movie even has a straight-up music video in the middle of a major plot development. Everything about it feels like a manic episode, and that home movie vibe I described in Under the Cherry Moon is ratcheted up to 10 in the process. Now, some of this admittedly works in the film's favor. For example, the music video I mentioned was for the song Thieves in the Temple, and that's easily the best part of the movie. Some of the humor, while also just coming out of nowhere and feeling a bit too cartoonish for what was established in Purple Rain, also works.
You'll never guess who's coming to dinner.
What? What is your main problem?
But the needless complexity of these choices, as well as the inconsistent execution of them and their incompatibility with the original film, end up making Graffiti Bridge harder to follow than it already would have been. Worse, it confuses the movie past the point of comprehension. Prince considered this his take on a 1950s rock and roll movie, and he also told Rolling Stone that he wasn't trying to pull a Francis Ford Coppola with the film either. Which almost reads as a dig at Magnolia, since Coppola's The Godfather served as the inspiration for one of the best parts of Purple Rain. But as I'm sure you'll be able to tell once I dig into its production and themes, the movie itself tells a very different story. Add to that some truly horrendous dialogue, even less actors than what we got in Purple Rain or Under the Cherry Moon, and the fact that almost everything was shot on an obvious soundstage, and you've got yourself a major disaster in the making. One that only opened on just 700 screens and made back $4.5 million on a $10 million budget. For reference, Purple Rain made $70 million on a $7 million budget, and Under the Cherry Moon brought in $10 million on a $9 million one. However, critical and financial failure aside, there's also no mistaking that it's undeniably Prince's work. And if we want to get specific, basically only Prince's work while we're at it too, since, unlike with his other movies, Prince also wrote this and had been trying to get it made since 1987. He was so set on making this on his own terms that he even turned down working with Albert Magnoli on it, despite Magnoli being his manager at the time and him having recently directed parts of Sign of the Times and a few videos for the Batman soundtrack. This movie's level of self-indulgence is so high that the trailer even felt the need to name-check Prince twice while it was listing its cast.
Prince.
A few moments later.
And Prince. Graffiti Bridge.
Prince began planning this film sometime in September 1987. That version of Graffiti Bridge, believe it or not, was originally intended to star Madonna as Prince's love interest, though she declined the project once it was presented to her. It would get followed up in 1989 by a new script, this time featuring Kim Basinger, but that version of the movie also never came to fruition. What eventually did, though, was a movie that Jason Draper, the author of Chaos, Disorder, and Revolution, basically called Lovesexy the Movie. More specifically, he said that it was, quote, a confusing splurge of Prince's innermost thoughts, continuing to explore the album's preoccupations with spiritual rebirth. Which means that one of the threads we saw in Prince's other movies has finally become the central focus of its own story. And knowing a bit about Prince's background also happens to be something that he felt he was going through at the time too. Back in the late 80s, Prince went through something of a come-to-God moment. Though the story varies depending on who you ask, a commonly shared version of it goes that while waiting to release something known as the Black Album, Prince had a bad experience using ecstasy. High on the drug, and having evidently just met his future co-star Ingrid Chavez, he became convinced that the Black Album was evil and that God was trying to communicate with him. After convincing Warner Bros. To can the album, he got back to work and cranked out Lovesexy to take its place. A religiously charged record that, if you can believe it, gets referenced multiple times in Graffiti Bridge. It features Ingrid Chavez, mentions something called the New Power Generation, which is the first song that appears in this movie, and it even has a track named Glam Slam which shares its name with the Kids Club. I bring this all up because Graffiti Bridge is an obvious attempt from Prince to express something personal through film, and not through another person's eyes or something that has to be extracted from a romantic comedy like in Under the Cherry Moon either. He wanted to spell it out to us in as plain of English as he was capable of writing in. For Christ's sake, he spent multiple years writing and rewriting this thing. To quote the man after the movie's release, Graffiti Bridge is one of the purest, most spiritual, uplifting things he's ever done. A statement that he then felt the need to follow up with, quote, they trashed The Wizard of Oz too. Yeah. Are we sure he didn't ghostwrite Humble while we were at it too? But to defend him, he is right to suggest that this movie is one of the most uplifting things he's ever made. The overriding message of Graffiti Bridge, at least that I could parse from it, continues the thread from his other two movies about a man slowly connecting with others. The only difference here, though, is that as opposed to Prince learning about opening up to people, we're instead given a story about how he dates a manic pixie angel girl that dies and makes everyone be nice to him out of guilt.
What kind of noise is that?
The overall message may not be different from what came before it, but things feel wrapped up in a much more self-serving, dogmatic way this time around. Whereas Rain and Moon was about Prince being the righteous purveyor of something greater who had to learn how to share it with others, he's just plain stubborn in this movie. He's stuck in a loop of searching for some kind of higher purpose that's made him completely blind to his inability to interact with others. Take for instance a scene where the kid confronts Morris Day over ownership of Glam Slam. The movie plays it off as this cool moment where Prince shows up to knock some heads, only it doesn't make any real sense for him to do that. We know the kid has doubts over whether or not he was cut out for a career in music, and that he worries he'll end up like his dad. That was told to us in one of the only moments of fragility in the movie, but Prince just casts it aside like it was tissue paper, as well as also casts most nuance away. Whereas characters in Purple Rain called the kid out over his character flaws left and right, the only one to do that in this is Morris Day, the story's de facto villain, to the point of the movie barely even making an effort to show his band trying to push back against what he's doing. Something that I can't help but find a little interesting too, given the fact that he sacked the Revolution a few years before making this, and because he had also just let go of his touring band from Sign of the Times and Lovesexy too. Worse, there are moments that almost make it feel like he knows he's doing this too. I can't help but think of a lyric from his song Strange Relationship from 1987's Sign of the Times when I watch this. It's almost too perfect.
I bet you wish this was some old movie, yeah. Then you could rewrite my every line, sugar.
There's something genuinely fascinating about this because it suggests that Prince is aware of how he could be seen as being self-destructive. Parts of this movie feel like Prince trying to reconcile with his Rude Boy era, but falls just short of saying anything interesting about it. It's like he's trying to skip past meaningful contemplation about his life and is just trying to get straight to the redemption part of that process. The black and white morals of Graffiti Bridge, which are comparable to Under the Cherry Moon's good versus bad classism, fail to create the sort of morality play that Prince clearly wanted them to. We're never actually rooting for the kid in this movie because, unlike in Purple Rain where his home life was at least fleshed out a bit, we're never really given any reason to other than, it's Prince. We like Prince. Prince is cool. Ergo, the kid is cool, and probably right. And this has an interesting effect on the story because while Morrissey is definitely our antagonist, the lack of depth given to the kid's plight makes it easy to understand where he's coming from. Which is pretty funny since Morris is a much shallower character than he was in Purple Rain. They're supposed to be running a business together, and the way the kid is running it is antithetical to that objective. Prince is right to say that the kid should be allowed to express himself, but there's nobody to tell the character that there's a way to have his cake and eat it too like there was in Purple Rain. Prince just goes ass out spiritual here, and while that's good and fine, it lacks anywhere near the level of nuance that the more metaphorical Purple Rain had. And that's really saying something since Purple Rain was hardly nuanced to begin with. The irony here is pretty obvious if you want to dig into Prince's career. For example, I mentioned that Albert Magnoli had become Prince's manager for a minute back in the 80s, and that he was originally slated to work on this film like he had on Purple Rain. Well, part of what led to him becoming Prince's manager was the fact that Prince sacked his previous management when they started to feel like he might have been putting out too much music at once. They even said as much when they sued him in 1991. Anyway, Magnoli ended up quitting as Prince's manager and from Graffiti Bridge over creative differences that may or may not have had something to do with a lack of belief in the project. He was then replaced by two other guys who only lasted a year before also getting let go. To which Prince became his own manager. The parallels couldn't be more obvious as far as I'm concerned. And to that end, they don't stop there either if you consider that he would go on to feud with Warner Bros. Over his record contract and over ownership of his music a few years later. Even Morris Day's character feels like Prince telling on himself in hindsight. Like how Morris is portrayed as being out of line for docking his bandmates' pay for being late, when that's literally something Prince used to do to his own band members. Or the way that Morris is extremely horny and, no exaggeration, tries to sexually assault Aura. Sure, we don't know whether Prince ever went as far as to do something like that to someone before, but it still feels icky given Prince's reputation for sleeping around and engaging in what was undeniably predatory behavior. And I think knowing a lot of this helps slide Graffiti Bridge into focus. With this film, I can't help but get the sense that it's more a game of projection over who Prince wants to be as opposed to the person Purple Rain painted him out as being. Because if we look back at that first movie, the kid is an unexpectedly three-dimensional character. We know what his interests are, what his goals are, what his shortcomings are, and more than that, we get the sense that he knows all of those things about himself too. Whereas here, the kid is just portrayed as a victim who wants to run his club into the ground. Without a Magnoli or hired screenwriter to even his character out, we're only given a biased view of a situation. At the risk of sounding pretentious, we aren't getting the purple from Purple Rain. We're only getting to see red and blue as separate colors. Outside of that stuff though, Graffiti Bridge also continues to show us other hallmarks we saw in the other Prince movies. We see the kid working on music well into the night and much to the chagrin of Jill Jones. We see him continue to brush off authority figures in a bratty sort of way. We see him push people away from him, as evidenced by Jill leaving to work at Morris's club. We watch as he takes a liking to Aura and rescues her from Morris. Francis L. even comes up because we learn that he's killed himself in the time since Purple Rain. These details tell us a lot about Prince's personality because they each have their composites to the kid in Purple Rain or to Christopher Tracy. And now, because it's Prince running the show and Prince alone, it feels safer than ever to suggest that these reflect sides of his personality. Now, as far as authorship goes, it carries many of the defining traits of Prince's other films. It's comically similar to Under the Cherry Moon. It follows in the same highly personal storytelling present in Purple Rain, and it also continues to riff on themes of trouble with authority, religious connotations, and a search for purpose that appeared in those films too, as well as combines the suicide ideation from Purple Rain with the feeling of martyrdom present in Under the Cherry Moon.
How do you want to die?
It's just that Prince isn't taking a hard enough look at himself. The work flies so close to the sun of what he's going through in his life that he seems scared to. The film even depicts the kid as being scared of finding answers to the questions he has in some of its less guarded moments. While Purple Rain could get beneath the surface due to the help of forces like Magnolia, and Under the Cherry Moon's fictional story allowed Prince to nip at some of the themes his body of music would also hint at, Prince seemed to clam up when it came to Graffiti Bridge. I think this is best represented by the omission of the song The Grand Progression from the soundtrack. The song in question is a ballad that was later replaced by Still Would Stand All Time in the final film, and is a moving exploration of what it means to find love and dedicate yourself to it. But perhaps because the song questions the existence of God in one lyric and Prince was unwilling to contend with that, it got pulled from the movie and replaced, despite dating back to its initial draft that featured Madonna.
Talk. What's the matter? I ain't got nothing to say.
That brings us to the last section of this video, the limits of auteur theory and answering whether we can realistically call Prince one. Over the course of this essay, I've occasionally made the odd comment about auteurism and the ways that discussing film under that lens can be flawed, such as how worrying about whether or not a director is good or bad risks flattening the potential for discussion about their work. How interiority doesn't necessarily have to come from a director for a project, but could just as easily be from the subject itself, and how placing too much of an emphasis on what is ultimately just a theory could mean missing the point of a film entirely. And that's all good and fine, but that isn't even where the buck stops on the limits of auteurism. One of the most common criticisms auteur theory receives is the fact that it often leads to minimizing the role of others in a production. When people talk about how much of an auteur Steven Spielberg is, they seldom stop to think about the people who wrote the films he made, or the cinematographers he had chosen to work with, the choices made by the actors, or the editors who selected the best takes and assembled the film as we know it. Sure, Spielberg obviously had a major role in each of those things too, but a lot of auteur-first critical appraisal of his work might not stop to make that distinction. Just look at Prince's film career if you want to see what I mean. Because he did a lot of the stuff surrounding his directorial efforts himself, we can see just how important other voices are in making sure that a director's voice comes through as clear as possible. It sets a director up to appear more as a dictator than anything, and trivializes huge parts of the craft that deserve recognition. Not to mention, it's also vaguely dehumanizing because it paints the crew of a film out to be an interchangeable tool at somebody's disposal. Similarly, it makes the director out to be this borderline messianic figure who can turn water to wine for an audience's enjoyment. There's a pretentiousness that's inherent to auteurism due to how much stock gets put on the director having an overarching vision for his work. And even when that's true, that masturbatory regard for it sometimes has been misread as being an encouragement for directors to step out of line and abuse their power on set. Take Stanley Kubrick's extreme, if not just straight up abusive form of perfectionism when it comes to directing, or Lars von Trier getting accused of sexual harassment and abuse by Bjork, for example. Not to mention stories where directors like Paul Verhoeven allegedly misled Sharon Stone into flashing the camera in Basic Instinct. It introduces an ugly component to auteurism, where people use it and the greater pursuit of high-quality art as an excuse for outright inappropriate behavior. Nobody should have to get abused on set to make a movie. Regardless of whether or not they're being paid to play a role, they should be allowed to do their job with some shred of dignity to their name. After all, they're human beings. In fact, in the 2 or so weeks between writing this video and sitting down to shoot it, some footage of Francis Ford Coppola partaking in sexual harassment of extras on the set of his new movie came out. It's exactly what I've been talking about here. A noted auteur taking advantage of his position of power to make other people who just wanted to work with a respected artist uncomfortable. Additionally, placing too high of an emphasis on the art's creator feels just plain restrictive. Relying on a canonical reading of an author's work also means potentially missing out on forming your own take on it, which could be catastrophic in the case of some filmmakers like Lynch. Art is often subjective, so placing too high of a premium on the idea that we should only consider the artist's vision for something doesn't seem to help anyone. What I'm talking about taps into the idea of death of the artist. Sometimes, regardless of whatever the creator intended their work to mean or represent, we just need to come up with our own take on it. And if we can actually back up those readings with evidence, inference based on the context the film came out in, or the content of the film itself, even better. As far as my thoughts on auteur theory goes, I like it, but I also don't take it too seriously. Rather than look at it as the Bible on how we should look at and study a filmmaker's work, I think it's better suited as one of those things we can use to rationalize how a movie makes us feel. I've never viewed it as a way to decode who a director is, because people aren't that easy to pin down. It's little more than a tool for me to use as an enjoyer of cinema to, enjoy cinema. And seeing is a huge part of why I make videos or write reviews on my Letterboxd in the first place is to give myself an outlet to process something I've recently watched. I'm fine with that. Now, as for whether this means I consider Prince an auteur within the realm of film, yeah, I suppose I do. Mostly because I don't see the harm in it. He certainly had a brand when it came to filmmaking, and though I only covered his theatrical feature films in this video, would continue to direct the occasional direct-to-video, television special, or unreleased project for years to come. Sure, most of them are little more than promotional videos or performances stitched together with a plot so thin you could see its bones, but it shows that he at least somewhat enjoyed sitting in the director's chair. And as far as his skill as a director goes, I don't even think he's that bad of one. I wouldn't go as far as to call him good or particularly competent, but his movies do have a few moments where you could see his potential. Being a visionary musician from the era of the music video lent him some skills when it came to dramatic staging and choreography. It's the strongest part of the two movies he directed, and it plays fairly well off his transparent love of silent movies and early Hollywood. A lot of it just comes off as feeling very I went to film school for a semester and discovered Chaplin in a way that fits his personality. A similar sentiment was even shared by Miles freaking Davis of all guys.
His concept on the stage is like Charlie Chaplin. If you look at it, you'll see. You can tell.
If anything, I might even go as far as to call Prince's career an even truer expression of auteurship over that of some of the medium's best directors. I understand how wrong that feels to say out loud, and trust me, even I want to take a bar of soap to my mouth for even suggesting it, but I do think it's true on some level. Purple Rain is an adaptation of his life in the same way that Spielberg's The Fabelmans was. He starred in these movies just like Orson Welles starred in Citizen Kane, and he obviously wrote the music for these films too, similar to how guys like Clint Eastwood, Charlie Chaplin, or indie talents like Hal Hartley have done the same. Looking at the criticisms of auteur theory I've mentioned today, it's evident to me that Prince's attempt to direct also sidesteps a few of them. Questions over whether or not a director is good or bad are put aside since we have a frame of reference for the material through Prince's music. We can confirm there's a method to the madness regardless of his skill as a director. And even the issue of placing all the credit on the director gets pushed aside somewhat since Prince was a multi-hyphenate who played multiple roles in his productions. The case for his sense of authorship over these movies is so strong that, need I remind you, you can still argue that he was the mind behind Purple Rain despite not officially directing it. As perverse as it'll be to say, he's about as much of an auteur as an auteur can be, to the point where it sorta leaves you wondering whether there's any merit to the term in the first place, or if it's just a more pretentious way of saying that you picked up on a couple of habits or patterns in a director's work. All three of Prince's star vehicles are harmless, relatively short rides. They've aged poorly in a lot of ways, namely in their treatment of women and the consistent appearance of gay jokes in them, but anyone with any self-awareness can decide for themselves whether or not they can overlook that or if that's a deal breaker. And knowing a bit about Prince and trying to apply that knowledge to these films only services them more. It gives us the opportunity to squeeze a bit of extra depth out of them should we need that. To go back to the way I described my feelings on auteurship when discussing film, it allows us to view these films as dessert for Prince's music career. A raspberry sorbet, if you will.
Yo, Seymour.
Yeah.
What's for dessert?
Raspberry sorbet. Raspberry sorbet. Oh no. Kind you find in a secondhand store. All right, here's your $5.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you consider sharing it with some friends of yours, or liking it, or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And I'm forgetting another thing, answering that question of the day. I know I'm not the only one who likes A Hard Day's Night. Come on, let's just... on 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. A Hard Day's Night... Blue Hawaii, okay. Teach their own. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, consider subscribing to my Patreon or signing up for a channel membership. You could also check out my 2 podcasts, Media Obscura and Glaring Admissions. Media Obscura is dedicated to old and obscure movies and television, while Glaring Admissions is dedicated to newer or classic movies that myself or my co-host Raekwon have never seen before, or just haven't seen in a long enough period of time for it to essentially be our first watch through of it again. They're both available right here on this channel as full video episodes, as well as on their shared RSS feed. So yeah, bye.
What on earth is that? Some new language?
Read it. You know what it is?
It's nothing, you Lillian. You know it, but you won't confess it because you're such a coward.
It is something. Something you don't know, and you won't confess that because you're a coward.
This is silly, and you're a child.